everybody, and I'm here to talk about Doctor Who again. I know this is becoming the Doctor Who channel, but I thought I'd go with something a little different. I haven't really seen a lot of people talk about this particularly. I'm going to do a video asking the question, what if Doctor Who never got cancelled in 1989? So in this video I'm going to fix in between a lot of fiction and conjecture and reality. I'm going to try and make a video that I think is the most likely scenario with some of the information we've got over the years. So for a bit of context for those who don't know, Doctor Who in its original run lasted from 1963 to 1989 with a short break in 86. Yeah. This was a massively controversial decision at the time when they stopped the show, because it was arguably coming into its stride again, with a lot of stories like Curse of Fenric and Remembrance of the Daleks being really well remembered even today. The outcry was such that today people keep wondering what would have happened if the show continued. And in reality, it probably would have run out of money. Probably would have ended up becoming a cheap parody of itself. But I'm going to ask the question, what would have happened if it were treated right? So what would have season 27 looked like if we had actually got through production? First thing to consider is it's very likely that John Nathan Turner would have left the show by this point, leaving Andrew Cartmel to still be script editor, which was great, especially if you've seen the final 2 seasons of the classic series. He was a wonderful head writer, script editor, whatever you want to call it. But I imagine we would have got a lower profile producer. We would have got someone maybe with a bit more financial ambition. I can't really say, because obviously John Nathan Turner's forte was making Doctor Who on a budget. That's why the BBC really liked him. But if they got someone else in, maybe they could get someone who could get a bit more money out of the BBC, who knows. That's what I'd hope for anyway. As for cast, we know that Sylvester McCoy would have probably came back, because he stated in interviews he was contracted for another season of the show if it had been renewed, and then he would have had his Legend story at the end of that. Oh, it's key to note that Sophie Aldred probably would have stayed on as Ace as well, because she was very keen to keep going on this show. Maybe because she's the best developed companion of the classic series? Now, what about the episodes? We don't know lots about them, but we know that there were about 6 episodes submitted, taken into consideration, which I will go through now. Now, despite there not being any concrete plans for the series actually happening, 7 stories were proposed to the production team while season 26 was being made. Some of these have gone on to become audio dramas, and some of these have gone on to become books. So the first one that we have here is called Earthaid. It was a 3-part story that was going to be made by Ben Aronovich, who you will have heard of because he wrote Remembrance of the Daleks. This story was described as a space opera with an insect-like Japanese samurai-based characteristics called the Metatraxy, and they were going to be villains of the piece, whilst the moral of the story was going to be on human aid, on how people help one another, with a lot of the themes in it paralleling World War. Now, the second story may sound a little bit familiar to you, as it is entitled Thin Ice. This was, of course, a modern Who episode in series 10, was it? Yeah, in series 10. This story would have been quite different, though, as it would have taken place in London and would have transported between London and Mars, with the Ice Warriors trying to take it over, I believe. This story would have also seen the departure of Ace, as she would go off to the Academy to become a Time Lord. Being written by Mark Platt, this story is currently available as a Big Finish audio adventure if you ever wish to find out exactly what this was about. Now, something I didn't say about Thin Ice is it would have set up who the next companion would have been. An unnamed character who was essentially going to become the new Brigadier, who had connections to the underworld of the UK, I guess, was able to help save the day in that story, and at the very end it is revealed that she has a daughter. In the subsequent story, to be written by Andrew Cartmel, Crime of the Century would have seen the introduction of that daughter become the new companion. And she would have been quite interesting because she was a safecracker, a burglar, you know. And I wonder how that would have worked with the Doctor's ideals. Unfortunately, I can't find too much about this story, but it has been adapted as a Big Finish adventure. So if you want to go and give it a listen, I would highly recommend it. The next story would also have been penned by Andrew Cartmel and would have been called Animal. Not a lot is known about this story, weirdly enough, but it is apparently a Big Finish audio adventure as well, known as Blood and Iron. The next story we know quite a bit about. It is called Night Thoughts. Written by Edward Young, this horror story would have been set entirely within an isolated house. I'm going to imagine a very small house. And it would feature a group of university staff. And these characters would all be trapped within this house. And one of them would be revealed to be a murderer. This one actually sounds really interesting, and I might pick it up because it is, of course, adapted as a Big Finish audio drama. Now, it's funny that I mentioned World War I because we're actually going to have a story set there now, with A School for Glory. This does not have a lot of information about it other than it was going to be set during World War I and planned to use the setting of both the trenches and a British country house during the time, which would have doubled as an army academy, so I imagine we would have seen the moral side of training recruits for war. But this story was written by Tony Achells, and this would have been the final story of the season. What's interesting to note here is, despite Sylvester McCoy saying this would have been his last season, there is no regeneration story in sight. So I do wonder what that would have been like. Those episodes, it is key to note, were not definitely going to be the ones that we would have got. They were just scripts ideas that they'd got and were taken under consideration. Now, if you take a lot of this in, I think this would have been a pretty decent season, but I would have loved if they had integrated the novelization Long Barrow. If they had made that into an episode in season 27, which was apparently the idea in the end, that would have been wonderful. That would have changed the show's direction forever, and it would have been meaningful. Thinking about it right now, it's just awesome. To explain the importance of Long Barrow, because I didn't give any context there whatsoever, it's a good story in its own right, but it's very expensive if you want to buy it. The key points are that it reveals an awful lot about the Doctor's origins. The Sisterhood of Khan were the original Wanderers of Gallifrey, and they cursed the Time Lord species. That's not the species name, but that species, to be infertile. So 3 scientists, the Other, which is a descendant of the Doctor, or rather an ancestor, the engineer Omega, and Rassilon, they were the 3 who banded together to create Time Lord Society, including the genetic ability for regeneration, because now it is established that Time Lords are test tube created, basically. They're made in tanks, and their idea for regeneration is genetically enhanced. It's not something that was there from the beginning of their species. Now, of course, the Doctor didn't have any knowledge of this until it's revealed to him, but this was going to be the canon idea of how the Doctor's species came to be and why he is so important to the species. He also didn't know anything about the connection to this other character. But yes, the Doctor being the one behind regeneration was an idea that was played with all the way back in the 80s. So Chibnall, you are not original. I'm joking. But overall, I think that season would have done quite well. But as I've said, Sylvester McCoy would have left at the end of it. So who does that leave to be the Doctor after this? Now, finding out who the BBC would have wanted at the time is actually quite difficult. I know that they asked Richard Griffiths, who you will know played Dursley in Harry Potter. I think that would have been interesting. I don't know what he looked like at the time, what have you, but I think that would have been quite a interesting direction to go in. They wanted, I say they, Verity Lambert was asked around sometime around the 90s who she would love to have play the Doctor, and someone called Peter Cook, who was a comedian and starred in a bunch of comedies around the 60s to the 80s. So that was an interesting choice. I read up a bit, and he actually died in 1995, so maybe he wouldn't have lasted very long, who knows. There were a couple of other people who were interviewed, I believe. Rowan Atkinson auditioned at one point, that was for the TV movie though, and so did Rick Mayall. So if we're talking about 1991, 1992, who would I have personally gone with? And I would have thrown Richard E. Grant's name into the hat at that time. As we know, Scream of the Shalka and Curse of Fatal Death, he is quite a good Doctor and quite a funny Doctor. But he's versatile, you know, he could have been this dark, brooding extension of the Seventh Doctor, but they needed going into the 90s. Personally, that would have been amazing. And I'm going to show you a little picture I made. I know it's awful, but it's the best I could do with such a short amount of time and very little editing. So I would say that with Andrew Cartmel at the helm, with Richard E. Grant, we probably would have got some very dark stories, and maybe would have further explored the dark politics of Gallifrey, which seemed to be where they were leading towards. Anyway, we may have got an entire series set on Gallifrey. Imagine that. Imagine we have the Doctor exiled to Gallifrey for a certain amount of time. So it's the John Pertwee era inverted. So he has to take himself and his companion to Gallifrey, or maybe he picks up a Gallifreyan companion again. That would be really interesting. I'm just brainstorming here. This is just off the top of my head. I think having Richard E. Grant will give you so much versatility at that time to do comedic stories, to do serious stories, and that's what Doctor Who should be. You should have the perfect balance of the two. Now, I don't have set story synopsises ready for this, but if that's something we want to do in a later video, I would definitely get to work on that and plan like 5 or 6 stories as a synopsis. What if we went back to the Robert Holmes-esque horror dark style of Doctor Who? You know, that would have really worked in the 1990s, I think. In my opinion, if Andrew Cartmel had got what he wanted with the show, I think it would have ended up becoming more of a adult and teen audience orientated show anyway. So we'd be seeing a lot more serious topics. We'll be seeing war, death, famine, the worries of politics. You know, I think all that would have creeped into the show a lot more, and we would have got more messages in there, and I think that would have been wonderful. Something I'd have loved to have seen them try and do at the time would be a companion death. How does that affect the Doctor, you know? How does he recover from a companion dying? Because at that point they'd had Katarina in the first Doctor's era, they'd had Adric, and Perry, they'd be the only three that actually died to my memory. And it would have been very impactful. So by this point, we would have been about 1996, so you would have got a long era out of Richard E. Grant, and I think he would have committed to it, because his film career and stuff, from what I remember at least, picked up after the mid to late 90s, so this would leave the window open for another Doctor, who would have been the 9th Doctor, Paul McGann. Now this is the idea that excites me the most. What if we got a full live action series of Paul McGann's Doctor, and it was done by the BBC and not by American companies? There's a great video out there. I will link it in the description. I cannot remember the username, unfortunately, but it goes in depth in the 8th Doctor's era, and it tells about what the Americanized version of Doctor Who probably would have looked like. That's not what we're talking about here, don't worry. We're talking about still under the BBC, maybe still under Andrew Cartmel, maybe a young Russell T Davies, perhaps, could have come along and wrote a bit. Maybe Terence Dicks comes back. Maybe you get someone like John Peel, one of the BBC book authors. I think from here, you go with the more chasey, romanticised heartthrob Doctor, which, you know, Paul McGann definitely would have been. I think you'd get a lot more use out of the Daleks and the start of possibly a Time War story going there. I know that's easy to say now, but imagine if you got more and more ideas that the Time Lords were even more and more corrupt, and then you realise the Daleks are going to stand up to them, of all people, and they go to war. And what does the Doctor do during war? And then you have his finale be him deciding to finally fight in it, and he dies. And that could be the end of the show if you wanted it to be, or you could bring it back in a couple of years. It's a really interesting concept. I think you would have got quite a good few years out of Paul McGann, so I'm going to say, again, 4 seasons. So the show ends in 2000. And from there, that gives it plenty of time to go on a break. Gives it plenty of time to refresh itself a bit, and you can still have the 2005 revival if you want. I really hope you like this timeline idea. I know it's not the most filled in, but I will work on a sequel video to this where I actually have story ideas and arc ideas written into some form for you all. But yeah, I would absolutely have adored this if it had continued to happen. Imagine Richard E. Grant as the Doctor. Imagine Paul McGann getting more than one or two if you count Night of the Doctor, 2 live action escapades as the Doctor. It would be amazing. And as I say, if they could have convinced the BBC to throw a little more money at it, it could have looked great during the 90s. It just seemed like a perfect time to have this darker, edgier story for the show, you know? And it's a massively missed opportunity, and I hope BBC know that. This has been a very fun video to make, and I hope that you've come away with something that's a bit substantial, you know? It's been very fun for me to think about and to research a little bit. And yeah, please stay subscribed, like the video, share it around, and hopefully I'll get a part 2 to you very soon with the actual story ideas.